the very first play that I wrote for a young audience, for a professional theatre company, was Lifeboat in 2001. It's quite a big turning point for me, I think, that particular production. We've been talking, it was produced by Catherine Wheel's Theatre Company and directed by Jill Robertson, and we've been talking about it for a very long time, because I had always had quite a big association with young writers, and I'd always worked with young people doing workshops associated with my other plays, because one of my plays' heritage is on the syllabus, the higher syllabus here, and therefore I'd kind of been in schools a lot, working in schools and working with young people within different social contexts. So I'd worked with children whose parents had mental health problems, I'd worked with children whose parents had addiction issues, or domestic violence issues, and I'd done a number of writing projects. Plus I've been doing Traverse Theatre's Class Act, which I'll probably talk about a bit later as well. So Lifeboat was the first major piece of writing that I did for a young audience, and it's been the most successful to date. Lifeboat was, there's several different challenges. It not only was my first play for children and young people officially, but it was also a play about war. However, that's again another one of my themes, major themes, is war. It's a piece about two real teenage girls surviving a torpedo strike on their ocean liner when they're being sent as refugees from the UK to Canada during the Second World War. And so we'd met these people, myself and the director, spent the weekend with the main character in Lifeboat and heard her life story, and a very traumatic part of her life story. So there was a huge amount of responsibility, and how do you make war, how do you communicate about war to young people and make it entertaining? How do you convey truthfully and yet dramatically, literally, someone's life story? So there were quite a lot of different challenges in it.
Did you feel you had to make any changes to your sort of style, or think differently about who the audience was going to be? Because I think writing young characters is one thing, but writing for a young audience with young characters, well, you always have young characters in there, but writing for that young audience, did you have to think about things structurally in a different kind of a way?
Not really, because actually I used the structure, pretty much the structure of Lifeboat was inspired by the structure of Death of a Salesman by Arthur Miller. Once we actually discussed what it was going to be about, and once I'd heard the story, I remember very clearly saying to the director in a development workshop, I think we need to use this structure for Lifeboat. And she said, I don't really know this play, explain it to me. So I broke it down on the wall for her and explained the way Death of a Salesman works and how it jumps backwards and forwards between past and present, and then has yet another time layer in it as well. And we agreed on that. So not really. I learned a tremendous amount though from writing Lifeboat. I learned how to write plays properly, I think, to be perfectly honest. Because one of the things that I think, and that was partly as well working with someone who's as good at making work for children and young people as Jill Robertson. She's an excellent director and I've worked with her several times now. She totally gets it and understands the word play in all of its meanings. And I think sometimes when we write for adults, we forget that. We become terribly concept driven and become terribly ego driven sometimes as playwrights when we write for adults, because we want to be recognised as being terribly clever and terribly literary. And you can do that with children, but plays are a different kind of clever. And I think that for me that was the turning point for me in actually realising that and accepting that in order to write a really good play, whether you're writing it for children or adults, you have to understand this very different type of clever rather than an intellectual and conceptual clever. So I suppose for me what I realised during that particular process of writing Lifeboat was the value in the entertainment aspect of it, because there are kind of 7 key parts to plot for me when you write drama, and one of the key ones is progression. You have to keep it moving. You have to keep it moving even when it doesn't seem to be moving, when it's not really moving in a way, it has to look like it's moving. And for young audiences you really must, which doesn't mean that they necessarily have short attention spans or they can't listen to something, because they really can. And Lifeboat in particular, it's a very linguistic play. My style is very lyrical as a writer. It's quite poetic in some respects. But they bought into that entirely simply because there was conflict, there was action, there was tension, there was something at stake. And at every single moment there was kind of, a point of crisis. And so I learned an awful lot about writing plays just by writing Lifeboat. The other thing that I really began to understand in Lifeboat is the centrality of the image in drama, that actually the image conveys so much on multiple levels. What I mean by the image is the psychospatial thing within drama, and that you can say so much by having a really clear visual image in your head. And I think particularly within the British tradition, we're so linguistic, we're so word-based, that we almost write plays like they're novels, and they're really not novels. The language is incredibly important, and it's incredibly important to me, but the actual image that you construct, the poetry and the visual, is so important, and you write to be interpreted. You write to be interpreted by the director and the actors and then the audience. So and I think that's what drama should do all the time, that it's a different type of reflection. And I tell you the other thing that's really that is really interesting when you write for children, and that just makes you a better playwright when you write for adults, is that you are much more conscious of your audience. You're much more conscious that they must be entertained, in a sense, if they're going to hear anything or derive anything of value. There must be a balance. I think, for me, there must be a balance between saying what it is you want to say, but finding the way to say it.
Just while you were speaking, I was thinking, it's something a couple of the other writers I've interviewed talked about, that by kind of writing for young audiences, or maybe more rooted within their plays for young audiences, for children or young people, they've talked about how they've then discovered their writer's voice. Is that something you experienced to any degree?
Not really. I think I kind of had it fairly... I wrote my first play for children and young people 10 years after writing my first play for adults, and I kind of knew my voice. I was beginning to know my voice fairly well by then, and that's again, I think, why they commissioned me, because of that. No, I don't think it was, but I think I learned about, my sense of drama deepened, of writing for theatre certainly deepened, and as I said earlier on, about the number of different things you have to consider in a performance, that it's not all about dialogue, and it's not all about, that certainly deepened. And for me, that had always been there, of course. The visual image was really important. But when I talk about visual image, what I mean are stage directions, because I think stage directions are a total misnomer, that they're not directions. That's not what we're doing as playwrights. We're not directing. What we're doing is we're trying to put, very briefly and in a very distilled way, an image that tells the story at the beginning of each scene, and perhaps through the scene, but visual moments, because you have to see a play as well as hear it. And I always had, but I think on Lifeboat, there was a transition there, certainly, or an affirmation of that, and I used that a lot more, I think, and the physicality of the stage, and the theatrical possibility of a stage.
I'm quite interested, because writers might find themselves in that situation where they are in a collaborative milieu as the role of the writer within the devising context. And I was wondering if you could talk about how that was for you, collaborating with a director and a designer and as the writer, and sort of how you sort of drew from their skills and inspirations into, and how you place that within your own writing.
Okay, well, I would say two things about that. Firstly, it's an awful lot of fun when it works. I think that collaboration is a really difficult thing to do, because I think that, and sometimes I would honestly say that within children's theatre, there can be a lack of respect actually for the writer sometimes. And I've worked in certain contexts where that's the case, and I think that can make life very difficult, because I think sometimes by not so good practitioners, when they ask us to be part of a devising process, What they're actually saying is, I've got this idea in my head and I would like you to telepathically understand that in your head and then write that for me. And that isn't what I do, and it's not what we should be doing. I think when collaboration doesn't work, it's when everyone is everything. And I think there's a misunderstanding about what collaboration is. But communication is the key. Building in lots of review points. Never trying to take over somebody else's job either. But also to not allow yourself to become, I think, to be put upon in that sense. You know, often as a writer, many times I've found myself in the position of being left, holding the baby, going, make something, but make sure it's something that I want. As a playwright or as a theatre artist of any sort, going to work with children and young people. There are 4 elements to it for me because I've done so much of this work. It's something I've always maintained. For me, the first thing is you're developing audiences for the future. You know, you're keeping theatre alive, and that's incredibly important because again, this is about ego. A lot of us, when we go into theatre, are primarily, and I have been like this too, so I'm not really condemning anyone else because I have done this as well, but when one starts, one becomes terribly obsessed with fame and being known and then possibly with making money once you get a little bit established and making your living out of it. But actually, you know, you should always be driven by your passion because it's a lifestyle choice. No one knows you're living when you go into this job. The 4 elements are developing young audiences for the future, developing young artists for the future as well. So you're modelling something, and that's very important. There are 2 other benefits, I think, to theatre work with young people, and particularly with writing work. One, of course, is social and personal kind of evolution and development, that you are helping them to learn how to be good communicators. By helping people tell their stories, whether they're real stories or imagined stories, you're helping them somehow put the pieces of their own lives together. You're helping them form. As Simon McBurney talks a lot about this, from theatre to complicity, you're helping them put themselves together, in a sense, and form who they're going to be. You're also kind of teaching them how to communicate and collaborate with other people, which is very, very important life skill. And the 4th element of that it really helps with is literacy. You know, anecdotally, we do this project through the Traverse called Class Act, in which professional playwrights go into high schools and they teach the fundamental principles of playwriting to high school students between about 14 and 18. And then those very short plays, 5-10 minute pieces, are taken and performed on the stage of the Traverse by professional actors and directors. For me, it's often the pupils who are worst behaved and least academically engaged who write the best work. And that's often because they're either incredibly intelligent and deeply bored by the British education system, and there's no way they can express themselves within that highly tested, highly over-structured, perhaps, format. Or they're quite troubled and they have very difficult lives, and therefore their life experience is massive. And so what they're bringing to a piece of writing is huge.